You ever been distracted? My wife told me yesterday morning that she cannot look at me seriously right now. She looks at me and she just starts laughing, and this is distracting her from any serious conversation that we can actually have. And hopefully it won't distract you too much. I know that there are a few of you that are trying to stifle some laughter, but you're not sure, like, is he serious about wearing that? Because that's, those are the ones that are trying to be polite, that can't be. And I even had someone that says, is that real? Yes, it's real. If you pulled on it, it would hurt. I did, however, have one person, Matthias, thank you, who said, I like it, James. But I think that was the only one. But we can easily be distracted by so many things. Apart from something as simple as this, we can be distracted by a whole lot. And I would suggest to you that we maybe have never been more distracted in our lifetime than in the last couple of years. We are distracted by so many things that we are forgetting what is in front of us. We're forgetting who is with us. We are forgetting so many things by all the distractions that are in our lives right now every single day. And we're forgetting what we need to be doing because of these distractions. I want you to turn to John chapter 13 with me. John chapter 13. John chapter 13, and we're probably going to take a couple of weeks to go through this. As we're thinking about this new year, with all the new things that come with this new year, guess what also is going to come with this new year? More distractions. More distractions. More things on the news. More things about the pandemic. More things about things that are going on in this world that are horrible and atrocious. These things are going to distract us. And so we need to be thinking about, as we are starting this new year, one of our goals should be not to get so distracted. Not to get so distracted. Because it has taken a toll on the church. It's taken a toll on the world. And the world is missing the church. So let's look here at John chapter 13. John chapter 13. Now, as we've talked about, as we've been kind of going through in John and these encounters with Jesus, we have noted that there has been 2 times already where they have talked about the Passover. And here is the last one. Here is the last one. John 13 through 17, here these chapters are devoted to Jesus' time with his disciples, with his specific 12. Chapter 13 through 17. What's interesting about John 1 through 12 is in John 1 through 12, you have the words life and light that is inundated with. Life and light. Life is 50 times from chapter 1 through 12. Light is 32 times, chapter 1 through 12. When you get from chapter 13 through 17, light is not the book of John, and life is only 6 times. In contrast to that, from John chapter 12, the word love is only used 6 times. In John chapter 13 through 17, it's used 31 times. The word love. I think that's by design. I think think that this is the bigger picture of here is if we follow in the life in Jesus, guess what we will find? Guess what we will have? We will have the love of God. And how does Jesus express that love to his disciples? What does he think is the most important thing for him to do in John chapter 13 as he begins to have a discussion with the disciples about what they need to be about? What is the most important thing he decides to do to represent that love that is there? So look at John chapter 13, verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now specifically, I think he's talking about his own being his disciples. Those 12 that were with them, and yes, including Judas. That love that was there with them, he loved them until the end. He loved them to the end. Now what's interesting, 5 times before he gets to this point, Jesus knows his end hasn't come yet. It is not my time. He says that 5 times. But here is where he knows it is now time. My time has come, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During the supper, the devil, verse 2, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. Jesus knowing. Now notice here, John is setting up here again the deity of who he is, of who Jesus is, and the human in who he is. He is also, this is what Paul commentates later in Philippians chapter 2. Hold your place there in John, and let's go ahead and just turn to. And I want you to read this to you before we continue on in John chapter 13. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. Paul says, "Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant or slave," as another translation for that, bondservant, slave, "and being made in the likeness of men, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name." We see there in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, where Paul talks about Jesus emptying himself and becoming human and becoming a bondservant, becoming a slave. We see that pictured here in John chapter 13. Look at John chapter 13. Verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, all sovereignty, he has all rule, and that he had come forth from God. John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and was going back to God. What do we know about Jesus here in this verse? And we take in the whole context of what John has brought us to know all along, that Jesus is deity. Jesus is the Son of God. He is divine. He is divine. But notice what the one who had been given all things by God, the one that came from God, the one that is going back to God, does next. This is a huge contrast in setting up Jesus and who he is. Verse 4. This Son of God, this one who had been given all things into his hands, and that he had knew that he had come forth from God, and he knew that he was going back to God, got up from supper, and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself like a slave. This work in which Jesus is about to do is left for a slave. This is not something for someone in the common house to do. And also, this was often sometimes something that Jews wouldn't even do themselves. Even if a Jewish slave was in the household, if there was a Gentile slave, they would have them do it. This was reserved for the lowest of lows. And now you think about Philippians chapter 2, 5 through 8 again. He emptied himself of deity. He emptied himself of that. Didn't consider it a thing to be held on to, knowing that he was coming down here to be a bondservant, a slave. And so he wore the very clothes of a slave and was doing slave work. This is the expression of love that Jesus wants to leave with his disciples. This is what Jesus wants to leave with his disciples, who are and have some distractions of themselves, don't they? At this point, in Luke, because remember, John has a different kind of storyline. Luke, Matthew, and Mark all start earlier in the chronology. But this is all happening kind of around the Lord's Supper. You see in Luke, and you also see that in Matthew. And what's happening here is what we'll see to get into the context, is they're grumbling about who's the greatest. They're grumbling about who's the greatest amongst them in the kingdom next to Jesus. Think that's a distraction? They're distracted from the presence of the Son of God because they want to know who is the greatest among them. We can be distracted by pride. We can be distracted by what we think and the great things that we're doing, or justify ourselves in what we're doing based on our pride and our ego, and miss who is in our presence. They are distracted by the question of who is the greatest, and they're missing the presence of the greatest. So he gets up from supper and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. So he came to Simon Peter and said, he said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Now the way this is written is emphatic. Like he's looking at, Jesus, you wash my feet? You can't wash. He was probably embarrassed. He was probably ashamed. But what's interesting is any one of them, because of the presence of who they were with, one of them should have already gotten up and done this. That's the irony of this. Is because they know who Jesus is. This was a custom and tradition of the time where people were walking around in their sandals all day and their feet were tired and sore. I'll get it out. And so they'd come in and they'd bathe them and wash them, and they'd put oil, anoint their feet with oil to help with the sores. This was a custom which was done by the slaves of the people at that time, slaves of the homes. So therefore there wasn't anybody in there knowing who they are in the presence of. One of them should have gotten up and done that themselves. But it's Jesus, the Son of God, God in the flesh, knowing all things and having given all things, who gets up and gets on his knees and cleans their feet. There's a little bit of recognition when Peter says, Jesus, do you clean my feet? There's a recognition of who Jesus is, but not to the extent that he needs to know. And of course we understand as we're going through the Gospels that the apostles there are not quite understanding the kingdom. They're not quite understanding all that's entailed. And Jesus, yes, Jesus is the Son of God, but they don't understand that, yes, he's been telling them this whole time that the Son of Man is going to be lifted up, that he's going to be crucified by Gentiles, and then he's going to rise up on the third day. That kind of stuff has just kind of been going over their head. And of course, equally too, we have sometimes a hard time understanding in our growth with Christ and God and how we are to do things. And so there is a growth and a progress that needs to take place. But there's distractions that get in the way. And they are distracted by who they think they are. And they're not quite getting who Jesus is. And so Peter emphatically says there in verse 6, Lord, do you wash my feet? Now Jesus answered and said to him, I think Jesus has shown some grace for Peter, and there's some times where he's going to get on to him a little bit, later as we know, because Peter's just not quite getting it all. So he says here to Peter, he says, what I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. Well, that doesn't sit well with Peter. No. Jesus, you don't understand what I'm saying. You ever thought like that? Maybe we've not come out and said something like that exactly. But when we read something and we see something and we see that there needs to change, we go, no, Jesus, this is the 21st century. You don't really understand what we're going through here today. This culture is different. This doesn't really apply to our, how we are in this. Our culture is completely different. And so what you're telling me to do in my behavior, which doesn't really mesh up with what I like. And so we kind of, like Peter, say, no, I don't want you to do that. So Peter, after Jesus says, what I do, you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. Do you think we ever need that statement said to us? In principle, all the time? Listen to that again. Now, I know there's a specific context in which he's talking about the washing of their feet. But think about the things in which we go through, and the things in which God decides for us, and the opportunities he takes away from us, and the opportunities that he gives to us, and all the things in which the prayers that we feel are unanswered versus the prayers that are. Look at verse 7 again. Jesus answered and said to him, What I do, you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. We just sang a song. It's one of my favorite songs. Farther along, we'll know all about it. Farther along, we'll understand why. They don't understand, but farther along, they're going to get it. But that doesn't, just like us, Peter's distracted by what he thinks is right and responds to Jesus and says to him, verse 8, Never shall you wash my feet. That's when you truly kind of get the understanding that Peter doesn't know who he's really talking to. God is telling Peter in the flesh, I'm going to wash your feet. I've already been washing these people. And maybe the other, it seems that Peter is either, in the middle or towards the end. It says there he's already washed kind of the feet of some of the disciples there, and he gets to Peter. And maybe Peter, being Peter, is the only one that's saying what is on everyone else's mind. Because I imagine that they're sitting there and they're feeling ashamed that Jesus, the Son of God, in their understanding, is washing their feet. But Peter is the only one that comes up and says, Jesus, you're not going to wash my feet. Jesus says, basically, let me do this. I want to do this. You'll understand it later. And Peter says, no. I don't think Peter quite knows who he's talking to. It gives us some insight into that relationship and understanding, which we understand later that Peter gets, right? But sometimes we can be so distracted by what we think is right that we are missing what God is telling us and where God is leading us. And we say no because we're distracted by what we want and desire and not what God wants and desire. We're distracted by self. We're distracted by pride. So, Peter again there, verse 8 said to him, Never shall you wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, If I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Jesus is more emphatic here with his response to Peter now. Jesus, I think, said, hey, you know what? You're going to understand it. You're going to understand it hereafter. Peter, in his impatience, and not understanding the situation, says, no, you're never going to do that. And so Jesus says, well, if you're not going to do what I say, if you're not going to allow me to do this to you, then guess what? You don't have a relationship with me. And it's not about the washing of the feet. There's something greater that's going on here. It's kind of similar to the encounters that we've had with Jesus already, where Jesus tells the 5,000, unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you will not inherit the kingdom of God. If you don't allow me to do this, then you really don't understand who I am that is doing this and telling you that I need to do this, and you have no part in me. The relationship is in vain. So, Peter, in his exuberance and wanting to do the right thing and say the right thing, that's one thing we could also take from this passage. Do you think Peter has a good heart? I think Peter has a good heart. I think Peter is ultimately trying to do the right thing by Jesus. I think that he's trying to do the right thing when he tells Jesus, no, you can't be killed. And he pulls up a sword and he takes off the ear of the slave that comes there to take Jesus. I think that is all based on his heart, that he has a good heart. He wants to do what's right. But Jesus doesn't condone it. Does he say, oh, Peter, you have such a good heart. Continue on with what you're doing? He does not. He condemns him for it. He calls them out for it. And so, while the heart is the important piece, it's an important piece, obedience is too. And we can be distracted not only by our pride, but ourself, but by our heart. And Peter is currently distracted by his heart and where he thinks and what he thinks is right. And what Jesus, the Son of God, should be doing. We can be distracted by our hearts. They contradict what God has asked us to do. Because we think it's right when God has called it wrong. So, again, Peter in his exuberance, verse 9, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. He's excited. He's like, okay, I get it now, Jesus. I get it now. You can wash my feet, and guess what? You can wash me. You can wash my whole body. Just, I want to be completely consumed in all of you and be washed by you. And again, Peter's not getting this connection here of the relationship and what Jesus is giving him as an example. And that's where he still doesn't quite get it. He's going to get to it here shortly. So verse 10, Jesus said to him, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. He uses two different words here for wash. There is the wash, which means kind of washing of hands, and the washing of the feet, and washing of those like much we would do if we were going to the sink and washing our hands and such. But there's also then the washing of then be completely cleansed. And so Jesus is saying, I don't need to completely wash you for you to be cleansed. For you to be cleansed. You and your relationship to me and the word in which I'm giving you and the reception of it and understanding who I am is what is cleansing you in your entirety. See, again, we're going back and forth between what? Spiritual and physical. This is what John is continually doing here with Jesus, the spiritual versus the physical. And all of these encounters that we had, and there are others, that is the line in which Jesus is trying to get them to cross over and to understand the spiritual aspect of things. The relationship is not about me cleaning your feet. The relationship is about me cleansing your entire soul and your relationship to God. Thus can happen. So what does he go on? Notice that through all of this, you see a couple of times where it says Jesus knowing. Jesus knowing that his time had come. Jesus knowing that he had been given all things. Jesus knowing that he had come from God. Jesus knowing that he was going back to God. Was Jesus distracted? Jesus was not distracted with his purpose and what he wanted to show them. So he says, verse 11, for he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason he said, not all of you are clean. So when he had washed their feet and taking his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? Now, notice down at verse 21. But we'll spend more time with this later. Notice down in verse 21, when Jesus had said this, he said, "He who receives whomever I have said receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me." He became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." Notice what the response of the disciples is, and yet another distraction. The disciples began looking at whom? One another. Why would they look at one another? It's not me. It's not me. There's no way. That's not me. Who is it? What? Oh, I bet you it's Lance. No, it's Steve. Steve, look at him. They're trying to figure out who it is. They're missing again the distraction of who is in their presence. They're distracted by their own pride again. They're distracted by the sin in others and justifying themselves. In that moment, when they start to look around, they are judging and justifying. They are condemning the others around them, and they're justifying themselves in looking around to see who it is. And then they want Jesus to tell them. So they talk to John. "Hey, John, ask Jesus who it is." Jesus knows all of these things going on right now. So back at the top, and we'll close here because we'll continue on with this in the future here. Verse 12, he says, "So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, 'Do you know what I have done to you? Do you know who it is that just washed your feet? Do you know who it is who came from heaven, the bread of heaven, the great shepherd? Do you understand who it is that just got on his knees and donned the clothing of a slave and washed your feet?' He says, 'You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am.'" He doesn't want them to miss that point because he has just done the work of a slave. If you were to see in this situation, imagine in this situation, you're sitting here and you're next to the King of Kings. Excuse me. You're next to the Messiah. You're next to the Lord of Lords. What is he doing? He's washing my feet. This is ridiculous. The king of the Jews, who is going to take out the Roman Empire, is washing my feet. Is this really him? He's acting like a slave would. Jesus says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, because I am." He doesn't want them to miss that point of where he is and who he is, but also what he just did. "If I, then the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Why? For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you." Here is the example that Jesus wanted to bring to his disciples, that he wanted them to leave in their minds and in their hearts before he went to the cross, before he was lifted up and crucified. This was what he wanted to share with his disciples to make sure they understood their place. Because they're arguing about who the greatest is earlier. And the greatest just got down on his hands and knees as a slave and washed their feet. They were too distracted by the world around them, by what the world said was right, by the kingdoms in which they saw that they wanted to have themselves, by what they wanted to be like all the other kingdoms that were around them, but to have a king that was all-powerful and eternal, that was going to take out the Roman Empire. That's what they wanted, and that's what they were distracted by, and they missed the presence of the ever-living God. And he came down and he washed their feet as a slave would. He says, "This is what I want you to remember. this is what I want you to do. This is what I want you to be about. Serving. Serving others. Do not elevate yourself, but humble yourself. As we learn later in the Bible, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and what? And He will what? He will exalt you. Brethren, we get so distracted by so many things that we forget this example set by Jesus to serve others. We get so distracted by all the things in this world that we forget about what our purpose here is. To serve and seek and save the lost. As we start this new year, as we are inclined to do and have different thoughts and things we want to do, might I encourage you to really, this is going to sound somewhat odd, but to focus on less distractions. To get rid of the distractions so that we can do exactly what Jesus has asked us to do and serve. Because when we get rid of the distractions, it is so much easier to see in whose presence we are in. These disciples were missing whose presence they were in with all of these distractions, and they didn't get it until afterwards, after then He ascended and was gone. And then some of the verses say, Jesus did this so that they would know and remember afterwards. There's a few times in the Gospels that, and Jesus said this so that in the future they would know. And so all these times they're coming back and they're going, remember when Jesus said this? You remember when Jesus, do you realize who we were with? All those distractions cause us to miss who we are in the presence of each and every day. And when we miss whose presence we are in, we miss the action that He wants us to be a part of, as being servants of His. I know all of you are probably struggling with distractions. Maybe you're even distracted right now. Let's pray this year that we simplify what we've brought into our lives. Maybe that means getting rid of some stuff. Maybe that means stopping doing some stuff. Maybe that means clearing up our calendar more so that we can focus on Him who is in our presence, and so that we can be better servants of His in this world, in this church, and in this community.